Let's talk specifics, shall we? We've talked about the basics of cathedrals. Let's look at some very specific buildings. Pay close attention. We looked at St. Denis already. St. Denis had the one bell tower on the right. Chartres is a little different. It's getting close to symmetrical, but not quite. This is how you tell them the difference. The next few we're going to look at look a lot alike. They were built basically during the same time period, and they have very similar elements to them, but there's a specific way to tell them apart. Easiest way, look at the towers. The towers were usually what took the longest to build. And when it takes that much time to build something, you got so many people working on a specific church that it can't be done in the lifetime of one specific architect. So the towers kind of give you an idea of where they were going depending on where they were when they were built. So Chartres, 2 bell towers. The one on the right kind of looks like a ice cream cone if you eat the sugar cones. And on the left, it's more ornate. It's getting more Gothic. It's starting to break up a little bit, okay? The idea behind all these cathedrals was a race to the sky. They were looking to get higher and higher and higher, closer to God, if you will. Chartres, the relic, just FYI, in Chartres, is a piece of cloth from the clothing that the Virgin Mary was wearing the night she gave birth to Jesus. Why Mary? The original site of this particular cathedral was a church for the cult of the Virgin, what was called the cult of the Virgin. So it was an early church that paid high regard to the Virgin Mary. And then that burned down, and they built another one, and then that burned down, and then they started to put they got that relic, and then they decided that it needed a proper home. And this is its proper home, okay? As we look at how long it took to do these things, pay close attention. It took almost 400 years to build this. So like I said before, you can see kind of the evolution of architecture within one building because it took so long to make. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that it costs just ungodly amounts of money. No pun intended. When you look at the amount of resources that were needed and materials and labor, we're not talking slave labor here, but we are talking indentured servants and craftsmen. And craftsmen and artists and artisans had kind of come into their own, or were starting to come into their own around the time of these particular structures being built. So they had something to offer. They had a God-given ability to be offered up. And so there was money that had to go toward it. This causes problems because you have to raise taxes, you have to ask the clergy and church officials to give some of their salary, if not all their salary, quite often for multiple years, to the betterment of the church, literally. So imagine yourself this Sunday, you're going to be they're going to pass around the offering plate, and instead of dropping $1 or $5 or $20 or $100 in it, you're going to drop everything you're going to make for the next 3 to 5 years in it. That's a different kind of dedication. That's a different kind of discipline that goes with that. They would also take the relics that came from the different churches. So your finger bone of Mary Magdalene, and the cloth from the Virgin Mary, and a tooth from St. Peter or whoever, the head of St. John the Baptist, which we'll talk about here in a second. They would send them on tour, and people would have to pay to come and see them. Very similar in the way I went and saw the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had to pay to go see the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, it didn't go back to a church to pay for it, to help build it, but it's a relic. It's a relic of a very, 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 very early religion, and I got to pay for it. Here's the fun one, is that they raised taxes so much, they would even, the church as a whole, would forge documents. Abbot Sugar was known for doing this. They would forge documents saying that the church owned more land than what they really did. And if they owned more land, if there were people living on that land, then they could charge taxes to those people. And then those people had to pay to help build the church more and more and more. And so people would revolt. There would be riots. They would run the bishop and the clergy and the priests and everything out of town for many, many, many years. In the case of Chartres, they ran them into exile for 4 years. So here's a little, we'll call it fuzzy math, but it kind of puts things into perspective if you just take basic numbers. So the going cost, if you did Chartres in today's money, we're talking $600 million. Okay, that's right around $67,000 a person in 1134. There's people even today that don't make $67,000 a year, let alone in 1134. Kind of puts it into perspective, but then, like I said, there's a little fuzzy math going on there, but just think about that. That's a massive undertaking. It took them a few years to build a bridge in my hometown. Think if it took them 400 years to build something in your hometown. How long are you going to support that? Here, we have the Royal Portal. It's very, very similar to a lot of them. West facade. The thing about Chartres is the Royal Portal, western side. That's what, everybody's supposed to go in, because you go under the tympanum right here in the middle, right above it. You have Christ in judgment. He's sitting on his throne. And then you have the 4 symbols of the apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have the winged lion, the winged man, the winged eagle, and the winged ox. But this particular doorway at the time was only reserved for high-end church officials. So your bishops, your priests, and also folks from the royalty that were coming and visiting, your kings and your queens and your nobles and that sort. We move on to Amiens. Notice it looks a whole lot like... Oh, that was really bad. Sorry. It looks a lot like Chartres. It's very symmetrical to an extent, but here you have pointy and pointy. You're going to have to bear with me just for a second. That was bad form. I apologize. Amiens Cathedral, it's very symmetrical. You have your 3 doorways, your royal portal. You have Christ in Majesty, even though we're not going to look directly at it, right here in the middle in the tympanum. But you have a little bit more symmetry. There's very specific with Amiens why you have so much symmetry. Look how long it took to make it. It took about 68 years to make Amiens. The first one burned down. They decided they wanted to get one up as quick as possible. And this is what they came up with. Amiens, they wanted to go higher. They wanted to go bigger. They wanted to just go, 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 go. And by doing that, it created a harmony of the style. It created a unification of it. So it's very symmetrical. It looks very much like some of the later ones that were built a little faster. It's the same layout as Chartres. It's the same layout as Reims. It's the same layout as Notre Dame in terms of it has 3 aisle nave. It has, here's your nave, the big long, right down the middle aisle. We have that one, that's the main nave, and then you have the 2 side aisles. So your 3 aisle nave. You have the 2 tower west facade, western facade, 2 bell towers. You have a 3 aisle transept. So if you go up all the way to about right here, that's where your transept is going to be, right before you get to the altar and the choir and that sort of thing. There's 3 aisles that go back and forth. They're separated by columns. And then you have a 5-aisled choir, which is up past the transept. And then you have radiating chapels that go across the ambulatory. The ambulatory, if you go down one of the side aisles of the nave, you would hit the ambulatory and go back behind the altar and then come back up the other side aisle for the nave. This is also a really good image that allows us to talk about some more of the architecture. Amiens is the tallest nave of all the Gothic cathedrals. Clocks in about 139 feet from, if you're standing on the floor, all the way up to the tippy top, 139 feet of open air. Before, you had to have support beams, columns, to have that so it didn't fall down on you. There's something that there are a couple architectural innovations that came about during the time of the great cathedrals that allowed this to happen. One is the flying buttress, which we'll talk about that in a sec. But one particular that you can see in this image is the ribbed vault. So we saw it in St. Denis also. That's where it kind of really got its start. Kind of they figured it out and mastered it there. But that gives a backbone to the vault. It literally gives a spine. And so that allows you to go higher and higher, and it supports those domes or those roofs without them falling in. We also see a row of columns, which is called a colonnade. So here, columns, your colonnade. You have a row of arches, which is called an arcade. And then if you look up at the top, Abbot Sugar was interested in bringing in light, and in Amiens, they brought it in droves. And the one way that they did that, we have this on quite a few of the Gothic cathedrals, but the way that they did that were these windows up at the top. Those are called clerestory windows. That level of a church, up above the colonnade, past the middle section, that's what's called the clerestory tier. And so those let light in, and it fills up what would be the dark, airy part up at the top, and then it just fills the entire building with nothing but light. And then Reims. Reims, or Weems, is a sister to Chartres and Amiens and Notre Dame. And if you look at it, it's very similar. Here's the west facade. We have the large portal. Now, we don't have Christ in Majesty here, but we still have what is called a rose window, which we'll get to, and then the larger rose window above it. But we're starting to see a little more symmetry. So we have the different sections, the different layers. You have stories of Christ and the apostles, and then in the jambs here, the sculptures, you have kings and queens and royalty and apostles. And then as you go up, you have more people from stories from the Bible and prominent figures and that sort of thing. And Reims, look at the two bell towers. They're very symmetrical, and look for that large, large, large portal. When I say large, I mean these things are huge. Not just the doors, but the buildings themselves. They were built to last to the nth degree. There is nothing in this country that was built in the 1100s that is still standing, especially architecturally. Maybe Indian Mound in Ohio, but it's just kind of a lump in the dirt. A big lump, but it's still a lump. Reims, I'm slaughtering the French, please forgive me, withstood over 3,000 shells in World War I. Well, how do you do that? Here's a fun little one. This isn't from Weems, but you get the idea. This is Amiens during World War II. You just support it, and save it the best way you can. You put sandbags on it. They took out every stick of stained glass in the great cathedrals. And one little kind of interesting nugget is what they would do is enemy bombers, even though they were your enemy, sometimes they would avoid the churches just because they knew that the people are going to need them. And then afterwards, they knew that the churches were going to help everybody rebuild their lives and their cities.